So we're continuing our series, working our way through the book of Galatians, and we've got to chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. So I'll read that to us. What I'm saying is this: as long as an heir is underage, he's no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Now, this coming week, half term, we're off to London for a couple of days, and we'll be staying near this pile, Zion House. It's opposite Kew Gardens, if you've never been. In fact, on the opposite side of the Thames to Kew. And my question is, anybody any idea what these three pictures have in common? Zion House, Alnwick Castle, and this person here, who is George Percy. Well, George Percy is due to inherit the Dukedom of Northumberland, and when he does so, he will inherit these two houses, Zion House and Alnwick Castle. He's now 39, and the current Duke would have to die before that happens. But when he's 18, when he was 18, he was due to inherit from a trust fund set up by his rich great-grandfather, a £1 million lump sum and £250,000 per year. And this was all set to happen when he was 18. But when he was 14, his father, who's the current Duke, took this matter to the High Court, and with the agreement of the trustees, asked the court to alter the time at which he'd get the money. Alter it from 18 to 25. And the Duke argued that getting the money at 18 was too young, and he could get into all kinds of trouble, all kinds of vices was the phrase that was used in the court. And not only that, it might put him in danger of being kidnapped. Anyway, with all these arguments, he won, and the time for his son to get the money was changed from 18 to 25. Now, this isn't an exact analogy of what Paul is talking about in this passage, but it is a question of time, a set time when a great transformation occurs, which is the theme of this passage. So I'm going to tackle this passage under three headings. Firstly, before the set time, we were no different from slaves, verses 1 to 3. Secondly, at the set time, God sent his Son to adopt us as sons. That's verses 4 to 5 and 7. And thirdly, in our set time, what does it mean for us? God sent his Spirit to call God Father. That's verse 6. So firstly, before the set time, we're no different from slaves. So look at verses 1 to 3. The image Paul is using for the Galatians, and us as we read it, is that before Christ came, an heir has not yet come of age. And if an heir has not yet come of age, he's powerless to do anything with his inheritance. No riches, no responsibility. Under trustees and stewards, as Paul puts it, who are in charge of what he does with his life. I mean, that's how it was in some senses for George Percy. His father made him wait until he was 25 to get some of that money. And that's how it would have been for the son of a rich Roman father in Paul's time. He'd have no access to his inheritance, to any money, until the time set by his father. And Paul likens this to being no better than a slave. He's as penniless as one of his father's slaves. He's subject to guardians who control his person, where he goes and what he does. And the money and property are controlled by managers. And he's got no say in how it is handled. So then in verse 3, Paul applies the analogy to us. When we were underage, he says, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of this world. Now, it's quite difficult to work out what Paul means by this. What the NIV gives us elemental spiritual forces is just the word elements. And the word elements can mean the basics, the ABC of something. And that's what the footnote is pointing to when it says we could translate this, the basic principles of the world. Or maybe Paul is referring to basic religious practices, sacrifices, rituals, observing special days. But the NIV is getting the phrase under the elemental spiritual forces of the world from what Paul says in verses 8 to 9. And here the word element seems to refer to worship of pagan gods. So in verse 8, he talks of being slaves to gods, which are not gods. And in verse 9, he calls these weak and miserable forces, which is again this word elements. And for the Greeks, the elements were water, wind, earth, and fire, which they often deified and worshipped. And not only was the word elements associated with them, but it was associated with celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, which they also deified. And behind the gods are spiritual forces to which, Paul says, they were enslaved. But Paul is not just talking about Gentiles. He says we. He's including himself as a Jew. So Jews too were in some way enslaved by the law. And the law had a tendency to make Jews slaves to legalism, relying on circumcision, on special days, on holy days, on rituals to make them right with God. And in verse 12, Paul warns the Galatians that by adopting legalism, they were in danger of going back to slavery. Sorry, that's verse 11. And this was as bad as the weak and miserable forces they had turned from. So what is Paul saying in this verse, in verse 3? The point is that Paul is using slavery as a picture of what it was like before Christ came. Historically, before Christ came, both Jews and Gentiles were in slavery to something. But also personally, the Galatians, we too, were all in slavery to something. The elements of the world covers all things in which we place our trust apart from the living God through Christ. They become our gods and we become their slaves. It may be slavery to legalistic ritual and practices. For those with no belief in God in this secular age, it may be slavery to money and wealth, the obvious one, and the ever-present danger. Or maybe slavery to career. We all need to earn a living, of course, but it can be all-consuming. Or maybe slavery to our bodies, our physique, our beauty. That's it's keeping healthy and fit, but some become obsessed. Now, all these things can displace our trust in God. And the danger is that, like the Galatians, we can return to some kind of slavery as well, which is what verses 8 to 10 are about. And we'll perhaps look at those next time. But secondly, At the set time, God sent his son to adopt us as sons. We're in verses 4 to 5 here. So verses 4 to 5 sets out the radical change from slave to son. When the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Now, there is so much packed into these verses. Firstly, it is God who takes the initiative. When the set time had fully come, and the analogy here is with the heir inheriting what is his when he comes of age, that this preordained time. George Percy got his million when he got to that set time of 25. And we become sons through God's Son coming at the set time, the time set by God under his sovereign control. So this is about the timing of the coming of Jesus. Jesus coming into this world was not a random event. God was not making it up as he went along. This was all planned. God knows what he is doing. Now, we don't really know what factors determined that set time when Jesus came, but we do know that it was the right time. Jesus coming was the most seminal point of history. It was the most monumental, the most momentous event that ever happened. That set time fully came when Jesus came into this world. And secondly, God sent his son. And this is God's son from eternity. And yet Paul stresses that he shared our humanity, born of a woman. Of course, he's referring to the incarnation, born of a woman just like us, yet unlike us, God's son, human and divine, born under the law, sharing our obligation to obedience to the law of God, willingly and gladly, yet unlike us, without sin. And thirdly, God's purpose in sending his son was twofold: redemption and adoption as sons. And redemption is about paying a price to bring freedom. The picture is of a slave market. If a slave was to be freed, they first had to be bought at a price. And if we were like slaves, as Paul puts it, then Jesus' death on the cross was the price paid for our freedom. And adoption as sons almost certainly refers to the Roman legal practice of adoption. If a rich Roman had no heir, he needed someone to ensure the family line didn't run out. And he would choose someone, likely an adult whose character was at least to some degree already formed. All the early Roman emperors, in fact, did this. Julius Caesar adopted Augustus, who wasn't his natural son. Augustus, in turn, adopted Caligula, who wasn't his natural son. Caligula adopted Claudius, and Claudius adopted Nero. And the legal procedure involved transferring the son from his paternal father to his new father. And part of that process involved his paternal father selling his son as a kind of temporary slave, and then the new father redeeming him. He could then adopt him into his new family as the heir. And it may be that Paul is using this adoption legal procedure as the illustration of what happens to us. Alternatively, he may simply have in mind a master identifying a slave who was to become his heir, where he would first have to free that slave and then legally adopt him as his son. And apparently that did happen in those days. But whatever the precise analogy, the bottom line is that God takes us through Christ from slavery to sonship in God's family, from slavery to freedom to sonship. Complete and remarkable turnaround. Just imagine what a slave who became an adopted son must have felt like. And the purpose of this adoption was that you became the heir. As Paul says in verse 7, if a son, then also an heir. And can we begin to appreciate the privilege that we have? Not just redeemed, not just set free, but made a son and brought into God's family. Our salvation is not just like receiving a pardon from death row and then release from prison. When we were guilty, that's justification. It's not just that. The theme of chapters 2 and 3 was justification, where Paul uses that as an illustration of what God has done for us. And that's amazing enough in itself. But on top of that, it's then like being taken to the palace from the prison and being told that we are being adopted into the king's family. Not only that, we're told that the purpose of our adoption is that we're now heirs. We're now due an inheritance. It's all completely undeserved, all of grace, all completely amazing and awe-inspiring. And thirdly, in our set time, God sent his Spirit to call God Father. So this is verse 6. Look at what it says. Here, Paul ties adoption to the Spirit. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So first in verse 4, if you look back, God sent his Son to procure for us that legal status of sonship. But then here in verse 6, we read that God has also sent his Spirit. Sent his Spirit into our hearts to give us that felt sense of our sonship. It's not just an external experience, something done to us. It's very much an internal experience. God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. So that the Spirit gives us assurance that we are God's sons. The Spirit helps us think and feel that we're God's children, a feeling that wells up from deep within. And as a result, the Spirit calls out, Abba, Father. So we're moved to call out to God, Abba, Father. Well, strictly, it's the Spirit who calls out, though in very much a parallel verse in Romans 8:15, it is us who calls out. So Romans 8:15, the Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. That same idea as Paul's been using here in Galatians. We're not slaves any longer. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him, by the Spirit, we cry, Abba, Father. So the two of us kind of work together in this, God's Spirit and our spirit. And what do we call? Abba, Father. We're moved in our hearts to know that we are God's children and that he is our Father. So that our assurance is not based on facts alone, as important as they are. It's also based on our experience that is profound and deeply felt and intense. Is that our experience? Do we feel inside that we're God's children? The Spirit gives us that deep inner assurance. God, through his Spirit, enables us to feel that he's indeed our Father. I notice that although this is an inner feeling in our hearts, it causes us to call out. It's not something that we keep inside us. Calling out implies that these words are on our lips, Abba, Father. This is about prayer out loud, calling out as children to our Father, to a Father who loves and cares for us, who's redeemed us and adopted us as his sons. Calling out in times of personal need and distress, Abba, Father. Calling out on behalf of others, Abba, Father. Calling out in fullness of praise and thankfulness, Abba, Father. But what about this word Abba? The NIV footnote tells us that it is the Aramaic word for father. So why does Paul use this Aramaic designation for God as father? Well, the Galatians have recognized it. If so, why? Since they spoke Greek, and I imagine none, if any of them, would have spoke Aramaic. The same with the Romans, who Paul also uses this phrase for. Well, there are only two other occurrences of the word Abba in the New Testament, that one in Romans 8:15, and crucially, the other one is in Mark 14:36, where the word is used by Jesus as he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Mark 14:36, Abba, Father, Jesus said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And without getting too technical, Abba is almost certainly the normal word a child would use in addressing his father, but also the normal word an adult would use when addressing his father. Now, you may have heard the idea that this word was equivalent to something like daddy in English. Well, that's almost certainly not true. In all three occurrences, the Greek word for father follows as the translation, and it's the normal word for father, pater, not a kind of childish word for father, of which there were some, if that's how it was meant to be translated. But the key thing is that Jesus calls God Father and does so repeatedly in the Gospels. And this in itself was radical. To call God Father was a daring and familiar term to use. Jews just didn't do it. Holy God, God of the universe. But my Father, Abba? No, that was just too familiar. Who do you think you are, some of the Jews said to Jesus, that you think you can call the Almighty God your own personal Father? But of course, just as radically, Jesus encouraged his disciples to do the same. Think of the Lord's Prayer. Father, Abba, hallowed be your name. Now, of course, Jesus almost certainly said these things in Aramaic. So the word he used was Abba. And it was such a distinctive word for God, such a marvelous way of addressing God, that his followers continued to use Abba, even though they may have spoken Greek. Maybe it gave them a sense of closeness to Jesus, using the same word as he did in talking to his Father. And the Galatians didn't speak Aramaic, they spoke Greek, yet this is the term they recognized as addressing God as Father. Same with the Christians in Rome. Christians had learnt this Aramaic word because it brought them closer to both the Father and to Jesus. So Paul is saying that Christians address God in the same way as Jesus. Not surprising if it is the Spirit of Jesus, as he calls him, within our hearts, which causes us to address God. And the word that was on Jesus' lips is now on ours. We're now God's sons too. God is also our Abba, our Father. And we've got this remarkable privilege of being able to address him as Father in the same way that Jesus did. So how should we address God? Well, if you're like me, the most frequent way, in fact, that you address God is as Father, perhaps taking from Jesus' words and from passages like this. But maybe I do so lightly, at least partially forgetting what it means to be able to call God Father. And it does us good from time to time to pause and remind ourselves of what that means. The privilege of being transformed from slavery and being adopted as his child. The privilege of being co-heirs, as Paul puts it, with Christ. And maybe sometimes we should use that Aramaic word that was on Jesus' lips for Father, Abba. It's not some kind of magical incantation, but it connects us with Jesus. And it is his Spirit who calls, Abba, Father.